Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Philip Phillips, and I'm the Associate Dean of the University Honors College at Middle Tennessee State University, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our Fall Honors Lecture Series. Our speaker today is Dr. Denise Bates. She is Associate Professor in Community and Public Health at MTSU, where she collaborates with colleagues on domestic and international public health research and programs through community-based participatory research methods. Dr. Bates has worked with refugees for over 18 years in various capacities and has attended some of our lectures up to this point and shared her expert views with us. So we've already benefited from her experience. Dr. Bates's work over the last several years has been in the study of integration of post-migratory populations and the related and resulting health risks experienced by these groups of people. She served as Refugee Research Director for the Center for the Study of Youth and Political Conflict at the University of Tennessee, where she studied the post-war risk to refugee youth. Working with various non-governmental and federal agencies, she's contributed to the development, implementation, and evaluation of multiple programs in Mexico, Kenya, Israel, Greece, and Italy. Currently, major grant-funded projects include the study of migratory patterns and policy affecting refugees in the Mediterranean. Domestically, she works with a multidisciplinary faculty team at MTSU who are funded to study factors contributing to academic achievement in refugees and immigrants in Tennessee. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bates.
Now, do we have a slide changer? Oh, right here. Is this it? Got it. Hello, everyone. How are you? Good? Good? Wonderful. Anytime I get an opportunity to come out and talk about refugees, I love to share information because as we'll discuss as we move along, the more information we have about this subject, the more informed we are when we have conversations with other people, when we vote, vote on policy, those types of things. And so I'd like to share with you a little bit about an experience I had that was remarkably different than any that I've had over the last 20 years, and that is I stepped into a volunteer role. Even though I've got years and years of experience working with refugees and have a PhD in public health, I still was a novice as I stepped into the volunteer role in Lesvos. As I look at everything that I've done in the realm of refugees, I've pretty much experienced every step of the way because I study migration. The only area I hadn't studied was the entry point, when people are fleeing from their country and they're actually coming into another country, hopefully to gain some sort of refugee status. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about my experiences as a volunteer, and please stop me at any time if you have questions along the way, okay? Uh-oh. All right. First and foremost, let's talk about why there is a refugee crisis in Syria. In Lesvos, Lesvos was the reception site or entry point for the Syrians as they fled out of Syria and into Turkey and crossing Turkey and into Lesvos, Greece. So we have the Syrian civil war that began in 2011, but has been determined to be the worst humanitarian crisis since the Second World War. How many of you are familiar with this migration? Okay. How many of you have been informed or have been keeping up with it since you began this program or before you began the program? Right? So it's important that we know that over 250,000 people have been killed in this process just in the last 5 years. Okay? We have looked at the population of Syria, and half of the population of Syria is out of the country now. 22 million people in Syria were exposed to this civil war, and 11 million have now fled Syria. It's a very drastic situation. The conflict began with the Arab Spring in Tunisia, and it spread into Syria, and then the rebels launched attacks on the current government, which was a dictatorship, or is a dictatorship still. That civil war began between the rebels and Assad, who is the current dictator. Assad's father ran Syria prior to that and was even a more iron-fisted dictator. And so we were hoping that Bashar al-Assad would be less impactful, but that hasn't been the case at this point. So once the rebel forces began fighting there in Syria, the civilians were caught in the middle. And many, many atrocities have occurred in that country, just as such many countries that have experienced war. They experience rape, they experience genocide, they experience a lot of things that occur because of these war atrocities. This war now has been considered a war within a war, because now there's been the development of ISIS and a lot of the factions of ISIS. You've got the rebels that are also fighting there, and Assad's regime that is imposing a lot of the war crimes as well. So we've got lots and lots of civilians that are caught up in this, and this is why we've had the 11 million that have fled the country into surrounding countries, but many of them have gone on up through Greece as an entry point to Europe, as you well know. So when we look at this country's in a state of crisis. We have 11 million out, 50% of them are women and children. Unlike what the media tells us sometimes, we see that 50% of our population is actually women and children. When I was in Greece and many of the boats were coming over, we would see boats coming from afar and you would see nothing but men in the boat. And many pictures were being taken of the men coming in from Turkey in the boats. And so the media would say over and over that all the Syrian men are fleeing and coming into the country. But had they been on the ground, they would have noticed that inside the boat were the women and children. The men simply would surround the women to protect the women and children and the infirmed from being harmed or injured or going over the side of the boat. So we have a lot of misinformation that goes on with the media. We have to be really, really careful about that. By the end of this year, they anticipate that 90% of Syria will actually be in need of assistance, whether that's with food, whether that's with housing, medical assistance. So 90% of 22 million people is a lot of people. So this is a humanitarian crisis, and we know that it's not going to end anytime soon. So this is Aleppo. This is part of Aleppo, and it's probably a pretty intact picture compared to what is going on now. Aleppo was just actually bombed twice in the last week, devastating even more and more of the medical facilities that are actually there trying to assist people with their medical needs. Aleppo is the largest city in Syria, Damascus being the capital, and Aleppo is one of the target cities for ISIS, Assad. They're all trying to fight over Aleppo. Well, you see, Aleppo's there's not much left of that particular area, and so refugees are needing to flee out of the area because there is nothing intact in order to maintain their lifestyles. If we look, why does Lesvos get to be one of the first islands of point of entry, or why has it been? When they flee Syria and go through Turkey, then once in Turkey, Lesvos is only 2 miles from Turkey. So many of the refugees would get into boats and travel from Turkey, from the coast of Turkey and on into Lesvos. Lesvos is a very small island, though one of the larger islands of Greece, but it is the closest island to the Turkish border there. And so we would see that people, as they would flee, they would come to what they called the jungle in Turkey, and they would hide for weeks and weeks and weeks. At that point, they would find people who were willing to sell them boats or sell them a seat on the boat for each one of their family members. And when they achieved that slot on the boat, then they would wait until it was their turn, and in the middle of the night, they would run out to the boat. They would all pile into the boats, and then they would start their journey across the water. What they weren't told, though, was that many of these smugglers who were selling slots on the boat actually jumped out of the boat about 200 to 300 yards out and swam back to shore, leaving all these people on the boat with no idea where they're going or how to get there. So when we were on the other side, this is one of my teams that was on this side of Lesvos. If you look in the far distance, you'll see Turkey. That's how close it was. It was about 2 miles. However, that trek coming across Turkey was very, very turbulent and dangerous. And many of the boats that the smugglers were selling slots in were boats that were destroyed, had holes in them, or would barely make it across. So over 3,000 people drowned in the last year trying to cross from Turkey into Lesvos. It was a very, very, very sad thing. While I was there, the two visits that I made, approximately 400 people drowned, and we had lots and lots of people washing up on shore. And it was difficult. It was a difficult process. As I've been working with refugees for 20 years, and to see something like that as a human being was heart-wrenching. So we call it an entry point. Once someone moves out of a country into a new country, it's either called a hotspot or an entry point. And so we were working all of the entry points on the coast of Lesvos in order that we could receive refugees. We would get a lot of information about their travel, primarily from satellite. So there were many, many applications that you could download on your phone that if you were a volunteer, you would get information about where they were, how far out they were, and whether or not they were in trouble or not. And so this is one of those. So if you look at the far northern side of this, that's Turkey, and then we would get the information coming into Lesvos, which is on the south end of that. Now, if you see the blue line that crosses there in the middle, that is territory for Lesvos, and on the other side, the northern side, is territory for Turkey. We could not receive or intercept any boats until they crossed that international line right there. And so many, many people would go down before that line, and we could do nothing about it. So it was a frustrating process in many ways. That once if that boat went down where the red tag mark is right there, there's nothing we could do. We would lose everyone in the boat. This was, has anyone ever used Slack? Slack is an app that we use with, have you used Slack before?
Yes, I've used it with club organizations.
With clubs and organizations. This was a wonderful way to communicate, and I wanted to show this to you because it was a way that volunteers were able to organize in a very effective manner. So people were coming in all over the island. They would come in at the north, and then they would also come in down at the south. And so with Slack, we were able to communicate, indicating where the boats are coming in. For instance, there have already been 24 boats so far from midnight with overall 1,750 people. Okay? So we might receive anywhere from 50 to 250 people coming in on a single boat. So when they arrived on the shore, most of them were hypothermic and were at very high risk of death at that point because it was very, very cold. if you'll notice as you move down, it gives lots of good information about where they are, how many people are coming in, how many resources are needed in order to address their needs, and then also whether boats go down in the water or not. Many people were thrown out of the water, and then once they were recovered, they were all hypothermic and in need of medical assistance quickly. This is another app that we used, and it gave us an idea of exactly where each boat was. There was a pin at the location of each boat. This is an example of a boat that was loaded down with 250 people. So if someone is on this boat, can you imagine 250 people fitting on this boat? It was incredible. So what happened was these boats were in various stages of disrepair, but they would also be too small for the number of people they were loading on the boat, and they would go under because it was so heavy. So many boats didn't make it, or they would crash into the rocks as they approached Lesvos or right outside of Turkey. This is another boat. This one held 50 people coming in. So you know people on the other side who are smugglers are trying to make a buck, right? You think about the number of humans that are involved with loading them, women and children, and some men, the infirmed. Many older people were on these boats, and they paid $1,000 a head, anywhere from $1,000 to $1,500 a head. And then they each had to purchase a life jacket. And the life jackets went from anywhere from 200 to 800 euros, which is more, which is like $1,000 per vest in US dollars. Yeah, it was very, very expensive. And then we found out as people were coming over, that their life vests were filled with grass. So if you cut a life vest, you would see grass and leaves and different things coming out of the life vest when you know that all of those things will send them to the bottom of the ocean. So we had to send someone over there to start investigating what happened or what was going on. And once they figured out what was going on in Turkey, they busted a ring of people who were stuffing these things with grass and then selling them for anywhere from 200 to 800 euros to each person going through. So it's just a criminal thing, you know. It was very heart-rending to see what was going on. When a boat hit the shore, came in, and an infant was wearing a life vest that was full of grass. You know, you begin wondering about the human element. What are we thinking? You know, to put a life vest on a baby that is filled with something that'll sink to the bottom of the ocean. It's unconscionable. It's unconscionable. This is an example of the rescue boats that would go out. Germany sent a number of boats, and then Spain also sent several boats. The interesting thing was that as we were working to get people in and get people onto dry ground, many of the individuals who were working these boats would be arrested for human trafficking. So, which was an interesting thing because they were trying to save people and keep people from drowning. But if they crossed the border into the Turkish waters, then they could be arrested for human trafficking. And that's why we couldn't go over that line in order to rescue people. If people went down on the other side of the line, they just went down. It was unfortunate. All over Lesvos, which is typically a tourist country, their main source of income is tourism. And so all of the refugees coming into Lesvos would abandon the boats as they got out. And there are thousands of boats that are still remaining in Lesvos as a result of people coming out of Turkey and into Greece. This is a point of entry, the harbor, which we would hope that they could reach. If they could reach the harbor, then many of them did well. We had lots and lots of resources that we could provide in the way of food, warm clothing, getting them transportation to where they needed to go to the next refugee camp and that sort of thing. So this is an example of the harbor, which I worked quite often. So this was, I got really, really good at sizing up people because we had clothing, if you'll notice, in all these bins. It was pretty makeshift, but there were lots of clothes, and I would end up having to look at someone and say, you're a 10, you're a 35 waist, you're whatever. And I'd never done that before, but it was, as a volunteer, it's what they needed. And so as a volunteer, sometimes you step into a role that you're not familiar with, but it's something that they needed at the time. So that particular day, we had about 1,800 people come through, and we had to keep bringing clothing to fit people as they were arriving on boats soaking wet. So then we also worked in Moria. How many of you have heard of Moria? Moria's been in the news over and over and over because Moria was the refugee camp that was a transitional camp. They would arrive in Moria and get registered as refugees, and then they'd move on to the next camp in Athens, hopefully to move on into Europe. This became a detainment camp. After I left in February, it became a detainment camp. So they were holding people there as detainees because of all of the agreements that were going on to prevent them from moving forward into Europe. Okay. So it was a prison, and the prison had been evacuated, and then refugees, this is where we would bed down refugees on the island of Lesvos. So at the primary campsite, UNHCR usually shows up, and that's the United Nations for High Commission for Refugees. I think Dr. Fedzilla mentioned that. It's an agency that actually classifies individuals for refugee status. So UNHCR will set up, and then refugees will have to line up, and some of them will wait a good long time just to be registered as a refugee. I was actually a bouncer. So I'm standing behind this lady in red, and we're keeping the lines, keeping people from cutting lines and all of that. It was such an interesting experience because, you really do feel for people who are having to sit and wait for long, long periods of time. The children are very upset and cranky and things like that. Some of them waited 12 hours in line, and the children would have to wait with the parents because, as you probably know, and has been mentioned, if you have a child, you watch that child very, very carefully as a refugee because there are many people who might take the child and put them into some sort of trafficking scheme. So we had to really watch the children because even on the inside of a camp like this, we have people who have other interests and may steal children, and it happened over and over and over while we were there, unfortunately. So there was some cheer. A lot of refugees come in and they are experiencing so many things. They're grieving because they had to leave their country. They've had to leave their family members. Many have left situations where they were doing quite well. I talked with many Syrians who had lifestyles where they drove BMWs in their country. They were doctors and attorneys and engineers and had many professional jobs. But you also have the trauma of war. And so many come in with post-traumatic stress disorder. Many of them come in with physical injuries and things like that. So some of the volunteers would try to brighten a camp. You see how oppressive that is for someone to arrive in a country and then get put in a prison, basically. And so there were lots of opportunities to try and make things better. This is one of the spaces. Only women and children were allowed to stay in this space. We were asked to get 50 people in this space. So they would lie side by side by side by side. And from a public health perspective, it was really difficult because we had a difficult time controlling bed bugs and things like that because we had so many people coming through. Many of the people who had come through had been in the jungle, what is called the jungle, for weeks and weeks at a time. And so people were bringing in a lot of things that were communicable. And so that was part of my role, is to try and contain that. And so that was a role that fit pretty nicely with my degree outside of the volunteer work that I was doing on the ground. There wasn't enough shelter. We only had enough space for 1,800 people in this camp. We would have, on average, 4,500 to 5,000 people every day. And so what would happen is the men would stay out in the elements, and the women, children, and the elderly and infirmed would go into the camp. So this is just some pictures that I was out in the rain with them at one point, and I took some pictures of the men. We gave them anything that we could provide protection-wise, plastic, rain jackets, whatever, but it still was pretty oppressive because it was about 40 degrees, about 45 degrees. It was kind of cold outside. So outside of Moria, right outside the camp, this was a camp for people who didn't qualify as refugees. I think I mentioned to you when Dr. Fedzilla was speaking that many refugees who come aren't necessarily classified refugees officially. So as they come, they are considered economical migrants. And this was called Afghan Hill, unfortunately, because many of the Afghanis would stay here in this particular area. And it was very substandard. I'm not sure that it was any better than what we had on the inside, but we couldn't provide them food. We couldn't provide them any other protection. It was really frustrating. So because the island was a little frustrated with the number of refugees coming in, and as we moved towards the season for tourism, the country itself, what we have to also remember is the country itself begins to suffer. Because if they rely on tourism, do you think people are actually going there for tourism? They're not. So many of the people on the island were starving themselves. They couldn't make a living. What they had, they would have to resort to other means, relying on the government, things like that, because they couldn't make a living with the tourist industry tanking the way it has in the last 2 years. So they got upset. They got a little angry, and there was an altercation at Moria. This just happened about a month ago, and they burned Moria. And so 5,000 refugees were out of the camp and into a space of dependency again on the elements, and it's frustrating and it's disappointing. But what we have to understand is that for a country to receive the number of people that they've received, there's a great stress on the country and the people that are living in that country. We had medical clinics and supplies in a number of the receiving camps. Moria was just one of those. This is these are medical tents that were actually set up in another camp that was sponsored by the International Rescue Committee as IRC, which this is IRC. So we also worked with the International Rescue Committee on another part of the island. And in this particular area, we received some of the high medical need patients in this particular area. All over the island, there were lots and lots of political statements. Some people were very, very supportive of refugees and tried to support the numbers that were coming in. And then there were lots of people who couldn't make a living, and then they were actually pushing back And so there was a constant struggle. As a volunteer, we were kind of in the middle of all that. So some people loved us, and then some people did not want us on their island. And so as a volunteer, when you're working in public health sector, you have to understand that both sides of the equation are valid and learn to navigate that in a way that's hopefully productive for everyone. So all along the coastline, we saw evidence of what was happening. Not only were there boats, and are there boats everywhere, but lots and lots of loss. You know, this country has lost, the people have lost, we as an international community have lost when war happens. And so we had lots and lots of evidence of that. This is a place on the island where they take all of the life preservers. And it's a mound you just wouldn't believe. You can probably, it's probably the size of a football field at this point. The number of life preservers that are dumped there. And so it's a constant reminder that this is, you know, war is really is really a frustrating process, and war is a devastating process. Hopefully, more and more of us, as we get involved and learn more about what's going on, we can advocate for policy that helps these situations. All right, so from the primary camp, as they move along, for instance, the 5,000 people who were displaced from the Moria fire just recently, they actually take a ferry and go over to the main island of Athens. And so when they arrive in Athens, they arrive at a port there where there are lots of volunteers. We actually worked the port for a while. So we were standing over here with all the volunteers waiting on the ferry to come in. And as I mentioned, lots of people have a lot of goodwill around this. They really do feel that they are an instrument in assisting with this refugee crisis. And then we have those who are very frustrated by the process as well. So this was a group. These two were Danish, and they were providing food and assistance for all of the refugees coming in. So at this point, we have so much around policy, laws going on with the UN, the United Nations, and so many people are kind of stuck. They're stuck in Greece, they're stuck in Germany, they're stuck along the way in Macedonia. They're having difficulty getting to a point where they feel safe. And so this is actually a picture there in Athens of people waiting at the port. This is in the port building, but some people are actually living there. They've been living there now for 6 months, trying to get passage on into Europe. So what can you do? This is really the message that I want to deliver. This particular war has been monumental. It's such a large humanitarian crisis. Each of us feel like we can't make a difference. We can't do anything. But we can. First of all, educate yourself, not only in this venue, but in other venues. Participate, understand what's really going on. Don't listen to just what the media is saying. Go out and investigate that for yourself. Tell others, educate others about this, because many of you in here have learned something new in this series. I asked in my class 2 weeks ago, I have three courses. In each of those courses I said, does anyone know about Aleppo and the crisis, the refugee crisis in the Mediterranean? I may have had 2 students in each class know what's going on. And so people aren't watching the news. I say watch the news, but be very discriminating about that. Realize that the media doesn't represent the truth sometimes. And so we really have to go dig for ourselves. The BBC tends to cover it a little more objectively, what I found. Call your congressperson. If this really frustrates you, you are all voting age. You are constituents, and so you have power. So you can educate that congressperson about actually what's going on and why we would want to bring them into the U.S. Write an editorial. All of you have editorial voice, so you're able to submit editorials. You can submit those to the newspaper right here in Nashville and educate people about what's going on and what the policies are and how sometimes what the media represents isn't really the truth, and we need to understand what the truth is. If you're interested, there's a Facebook page that is actually, it's a private page, but you can request entry in, and it's called Know Them, Only Us, Refugee and Displaced Persons, and it kind of gives you an idea of what's going on the ground in Lesvos. It also tells you what's going on the ground in Turkey as well. Also, volunteer. They're calling for volunteers each and every day. They're desperate for people to come in and volunteer. If you can volunteer 2 to 3 or 4 weeks over Christmas break, do it. It's a wonderful experience, and you get a perspective that no one else has here on the ground. So I encourage you to look into this, get more and more information, be well informed, and then volunteer if you have the capacity to do that. Okay. All right, any questions? Yes, ma'am.
So Turkey, they're not helping the Syrians?
Turkey was actually paid by the UN, given a large sum of money to manage the Syrians that they have in their country. Turkey actually has more Syrians in their country than any of the surrounding countries. And so there are agencies, there are nonprofits that are working in Turkey to provide assistance, and there are some people who are Turkish and providing assistance, but not nearly enough, not nearly enough. Most people want to get out of Turkey and on up into Europe, where they feel like they have more opportunities up there. Yeah.
In that same vein, you said that the Turkish government reserved the right to prosecute people who attempted to rescue migrants across that international line as human traffickers. How frequent were Turkish patrols through that area, and were they doing things to try to prevent people from boarding those vessels to begin with, or were they rescuing people should boats capsize?
So here was the motivation for Turkey. Turkey had an agreement with the UN for a large sum of money to keep the Syrians from crossing. So they would try to prevent them from crossing on shore. If they actually got into the water to cross over, then they would not do anything if they went under. So the Turkish government had boats every night. So did the Greek government. They had boats every night, and they were trying to deter the crossing of these thousands and thousands of people. I believe 3 million people, I think the number's 3 million now. They're still coming. I'm still on Slack, and there are like 100, 200, 300 people that come every day. But somewhere around 3 million people have crossed those waters specifically, and it was hard to prevent them from coming. But because of that political agreement, Turkey didn't have an interest in getting them safely over to Greece. They wanted to hold them in the country. So once they got out into the waters, they washed their hands of it.
With the EU deal, has that changed the migrant patterns from years in Turkey into Greece? Is it changing the way they migrate into
Their flow?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a very good question. So coming into Turkey, many of them are coming into Turkey and then being diverted to Italy, which is a very, very long trip, right? Versus coming across just 2 miles into Greece. So many are still trying to get across. Greece is pushing them back. Turkey's trying to hold them. But then because of that, they are creating new streams of crossing. I spent the summer in Sardinia and teaching on the refugee crisis in the Mediterranean. And there were Syrians actually in Sardinia, coming in Sardinia and in Sicily. So they made a very long boat trip to get to those points. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Was something that devastating? Like, how did you keep yourself like from breaking down, or like continue working and doing what you needed to do?
It's hard. It's hard. I think because I've worked in refugee camps and I've also worked in the slums of Kenya, where many people migrate, fleeing war as well. You do see a lot, and you see a lot that is very disturbing, but I don't think it's ever okay, you know? So as we were working, I think the toughest times is when babies would wash up on shore, and that was really, really tough. We all cried. And I have to say that when I got back from my trip in January, I started counseling. I mean, because you have to debrief this, you have to get it off your soul, basically, because it's very disturbing that this could be going on, and the international community is very blinded to it. We don't get a lot of this information. Maybe we get it in pods, but we don't get a lot of this information. And maybe we can't digest it from a distance, I don't know. But it's tough. And so a lot of volunteers would have to take breaks, and they would take 2 or 3 days off, because psychologically it's difficult to manage that. Many of the teams, I worked with a grassroots organization there in Lesvos, and they had a psychologist who actually worked with anyone who needed that. I think I was the mama in the deal, and so many of those of you who are in your young 20s, that's tough to come across the ocean and see that kind of activity going on. And so I worked a lot with some of the younger people and tried to allow them to just, spill. So yeah, it's hard. It's hard. I don't think any human can be a part of that and not be remarkably changed for their lifetime. Yeah. Do
you know of any programs that help with?
Oh, sorry. I was looking at you and your mouth wasn't going. Sorry. Go ahead.
Organizations that help with travel costs for people who.
They do. Actually, they're calling right now for people who they are paying for travel, which they weren't doing in the last 2 years. Now they're so desperate. They really do need assistance, and so some of these agencies are paying for travel. They're paying for food and boarding. Yeah, so it's a good time to go if you're interested. Maybe over Christmas break. It's not going anywhere. So.
I know that you had said that Moria got burnt and everything, and with Turkey like trying to hold them, do they have like a backlash from that? Like, do they have a drain on their economy from it or anything?
Oh, absolutely. But see, the UN is actually funding them. So a lot of, we're hoping that Turkey's actually getting some assistance on the ground there. I think what happens a lot of times, the UN gives money and they're not sure where it goes in many cases. But for those that are held in camps there, they're supposed to get a sizable amount of funding. Keep in mind that many of them aren't in camps. I think we were talking about that a little bit. Only about 1/3 of our refugees are actually in camps. So many of them are in the cities. So they're in Istanbul. They're in places which causes a drain on the actual city itself if they're dependent in one way or another. Many of them cannot work because they're not a citizen of that country, and so it really sets up a scenario that's tough for a particular country trying to host that number of refugees. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So, personally, what do you think the U.S. should do about it?
Yeah, that's such a tough question. But it's a great question. I just arrived. I was at a conference just 2 weeks ago in Washington, D.C., and it's a conference on public health disasters. And of course, this is one of our major disasters right now. And so the UN was there, UNHCR, CDC, all the government agencies. We had senators there, we had people. And, we all left the conference still frustrated because what does the U.S. do? Stepping back from, do we send in troops to Syria? Do we, how well has that worked in the past, to just to go in and have a military intervention. We're doing some of that already. I think that there was a summit just last week, 2 weeks ago, after this conference to discuss what do we do as a nation. And I think we have to, in some ways, honor the fear that people have around the refugees that are migrating, because we've had some incidences where there are plants, you know. But I want to tell you that in the United States, we screen people so well. We put them through 2 years of screening almost. So the refugees that come to our country are really screened maximally before they come in. And I think people don't realize how fail-safe that system is. Now, can people slip through who don't have a criminal background? And that's, I assume, probably so. But it's never happened. Typically in the United States, when there has been an event, the person who's come in is usually on student visa. So the student visa program, we really need to look at that if we're looking at safety and security of the United States. Unfortunately, we need to kind of screen that process. Refugees themselves, we haven't had incidences around refugees in the United States. We had a couple of Somalians who went back home, and but nothing ever occurred with that. So yeah, it's tough. I'm not answering your question because I don't know that I have the answers to that. I don't know that the United States government has the answers to that, particularly as a result of that conference. We should have had more answers and we didn't. Yeah.
I was just wondering if they included mental health in the public health arena, when you were saying that you were dealing with people who have PTSD and things of that nature, how do you assess and to what degree or what extent do you know? Because that can affect way more things than just, living with a communicable disease. And people don't realize that.
Right. Do you mean here in the U.S. or abroad?
Refugee camp.
The refugee camps. We have screening processes. I've actually been trained in refugee trauma and recovery. And so in public health, you can step into that world where and if you're working with refugees, you really pretty much have to, because people come in very affected by what's happened to them and their families. In country, there usually are psychiatrists and psychologists that come in from the UN or from other agencies who provide some of that assistance. But as you well know, if you're sitting there with 100,000 people and you've got 3 or 4 psychologists, it's difficult, right? You hopefully see the worst ones. And then the rest of us in the public health sector have to be able to recognize that and do interventions, maybe stress reduction, some of the things that may be helpful for them in that moment. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Any other questions? Did you have a question?
He actually got to most of it. You mentioned the volunteering, and there are ways to get there for free because we're not exactly millionaires here.
Exactly.
But what organizations do that, if you know?
Well, I would say if you'll go on to this Facebook page, they just posted yesterday We Need Volunteers, and they've got, they're very well organized. Many of the grassroots agencies there, they have a booklet that tells you all of the agencies that are on the ground in Lesvos and in Athens, Greece as well, probably also in Turkey. And then they'll tell you how to go about contacting those people. Carrie, who actually just posted that, was one that we worked elbow to elbow when I was there. She is there full time, and she actually posts in this probably daily about 10 times. So she'll give you that scoop. She'll give you that information about the agencies and that sort of thing. If not, inbox her. She's wonderful. She'll respond to you. Just say, you had gone to a lecture, now you're interested. You might like to go. Okay. Never at any time, I do want to say, there's always an element of risk, particularly in these kinds of conditions and situations, but I didn't really ever feel at risk when I was there. The situation is pretty well built at this point. In Lesvos per se, or Athens, they've been doing this now for almost 2 years. And so there are lots and lots of agencies who are experts now at what's going on with this refugee crisis.